Central Australia, one of the most beautiful and unforgiving places on earth. People are still lured here year after year. They're trying to find a lost gold reef that a bloke called Harold Lassiter said he discovered around the turn of the century. "30-odd years later, Lassiter found himself stuck in this cave here. At the time, he was slowly starving to death and was half blinded by sandy blight. But he sat down and he wrote a diary. It wasn't really a diary, it was a series of letters to his wife. This is a duplicate, a facsimile copy. And he buried it back there in the dirt of the cave floor. How it came to be found, and this whole Lassiter saga, turned out to be one of the great mysteries of Australian history. It all starts with Lassiter's claim that when he was just 17 years old, he found a huge reef of gold, 7 miles long and 12 foot wide, way out west of Alice Springs. Anyhow, 3 years later, he reckoned he came back to this area with an old bushman surveyor called Hardy, and together they staked a claim on the gold reef. In those days, they used to calculate their position using a sextant in the sun, but Lassiter said they got their figures wrong, and shortly afterwards, Harding died. It took Lassiter another 30 years to get enough backers to try and find the reef again. They formed a company called the Central Australian Gold Exploration Company, CAGE for short. They're a motley group. Lassiter was the guide naturally, but the head honcho was an experienced bushman called Fred Blakely. Between them, they had several trucks, a plane, and even a bicycle. The company headed off in July 1930 for Haas Bluff, out to the west of Alice Springs. See that lump of rock there? Pretty hard to miss when you look at it. That's Arts Bluff. This country round here is really significant from the expedition point of view, because what happened here was that Blakely and Lassiter had a great big Donnybrook, great big brawl. Blakely wanted to go west. Lassiter said, no, that's not the way. My reef's southwest, over that way. Anyway, Blakely was the boss of the whole schmozzle and they ended up going west. I'm not real sure why it was, but I suspect that he wanted to go that way because out there was an airfield. And the next couple of days he was bringing in an aircraft and they're going to start searching from the air. It really got up Lassiter's nose. That night, he wrote in his journal, how on earth do they expect me to find this reef if they won't follow my directions? And when you think about it, he's got a real good point there. The country is tough enough even in a modern four-wheel drive. But with heavy old trucks and all the equipment, the travelling was terrible. One of the blokes wrote, "Our speed was so slow that even the flies could keep pace with us. And they attacked in their millions. Everyone was fed up and tempers were raw." They finally got here to Yai Creek, where this airstrip was built. These old tins are the evidence that I've been looking for. I found another very significant campsite in the Lassiter story because this is the place they came back to time and time again. Their aim was to set up a base camp here at Ilpilla. It was here they kept all their main supplies, and you can still see bits and pieces today. They waited here for their plane to arrive, but that didn't happen. It had crashed near Alice and it took weeks to get repaired. Meanwhile, the others kept going about 150 kilometres due west to a spot called Mount Liesla. When they got to the top, Lassiter announced that they were too far to the north. Now Blakely was just starting to figure out that Lassiter had never been round this neck of the woods before in his life. It was with these suspicions that they all headed back to Ilpilla. The plane had arrived with another pilot. Lassiter took off on a recce and he was away for about 2 hours. During that time, he reckoned he saw the reef. Once he landed back down on the deck, the expedition pilot, the fellow by the name of Coote, tackled Lassiter. He said to him, I hear from the other pilot you found your reef. Lassiter said, yeah, but keep it to yourself. I swear you to secrecy. He told him something else. He said, you'll recognise it by this. And he drew 3 hills, he reckoned. They looked like women's sunbonnets, whatever they're supposed to look like. And there was a 4th one. It was apparently about 30-40 mile away. It was a big flat top turnout. A bit like a Quaker's hat, he said. Funny descriptions. Lassiter must have had some sort of hang-up about funny looking hats, I reckon. Can't understand it myself. At this point, Lassiter was convinced that the expedition should be really heading more to the southwest. Like $1 for every time I've done this job. It's okay for me driving around here these days. I've got roads to drive on, but way back then, no roads at all. They had that big Thornycroft truck, 6-wheel drive. Anyway, it turns out that they eventually did go southwest from Ilbilla, the way Lassiter wanted to go. In about 100 miles, they got something like 20 punctures. It was pretty rough country. You've got to remember what they're going through. They're going through mulga and bush and salt bush and everything. Bashing down the scrub as they went. In fact, the sand was so boggy they even had to lay matting on the ground to stop the truck getting bogged. Eventually, the boss bloke, Blakely, got so jacked off he spat the dummy and ordered everyone back to Alice Springs.
But Lassiter was determined by now. So he teamed up with a young cameleer called Paul Johns. The pair of them set off on foot with 5 camels, heading for Lake Amadeus and the Olgas. It took Johns and Lassiter 13 days to get here to Lake Amadeus. They just about had it when they tried to take a shortcut across the lake bed. A terrible mistake that nearly cost them 2 camels.
There's something out here I really want to show you. You see these things here? They're camel pads, they're wild camels. They're not loaded down the way Lassiter's and Johns's were. And you can see even by the tracks that they're leaving behind that they're starting to break through the surface here. Of course, Johns and Lassiter tried to cross this lake in summer. And that's the time when the rains are around the place. And out there in the middle, it gets very boggy. And that's where they made their basic mistake. They failed to understand and appreciate their environment.
By the time they got here to the Olgas, they were nearly dead. This is what Paul Johns wrote at the time. I dived my head into the water and nearly cried. And then he said this: Lassiter did not impress me as a man who knew this country, but as one who'd read about it. Strange, eh? They pressed on to the Peterman Ranges, where Lassiter and Johns had a huge argument. As a result, Lassiter took off on his own for 5 days, but when he got back, he was carrying gold samples. He reckoned he'd found his reef yet again. Johns was suspicious, but together they went back to Ilpilla to get fresh supplies. Johns continued on to Alice to get more camels, leaving Lassiter to set out once more, alone, with the remaining 2 camels.
Of course, if you're trying to move through this country, water's the #1 survival priority. And if you've got camels with you, little water snake's no good. You need a proper big rock hole, like this thing here. And how do you find it? First thing you do is look around the countryside, look at the landscape, see the mountain ranges. In this case here, I'm sure that Lassiter, when he came through here, would have hugged the edge of the ranges, looking for little cracks and crevices, and then he would have been listening. those finches. Finches don't go very far from water at all. And the reason why is the fact that they're grain eaters. They eat grain all day. They get thirsty down the throat, duck back to the water. So they can't range out very far at all. And wherever you hear them, you know there's got to be a big mob of water somewhere nearby.
Lassiter claimed to have found the reef by using this spot here near Lake Christopher as a reference point. But how do we know he actually got this far?